Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into a really complex, almost philosophical battle that's playing out right now in education. It's all about how we define literacy, how it should be taught. We've got these sources looking at the recent push for, standardizing everything,
Right.
and how some educators are actually finding, well, an unexpected opportunity tucked away inside these mandates.
It's such a critical conversation, really, because it's about more than just test scores. It gets to whose ways of thinking, whose minds we actually value in our schools.
Yeah.
And the sources use this really striking metaphor. They talk about literacy as this commons, like a shared space, a cultural inheritance of language stories.
Okay.
But these recent reforms,
Yeah.
driven by metrics and standardization, they've basically put up a fence around it, an enclosure.
Offense. Okay, I see where this is going. And there's a quote here that kind of sums up the tension, maybe our mission for this deep dive. They trained us to decode, we learned to discern. The law built the fence, but we built the forest.
Exactly. That's the core idea we want to unpack.
Yeah.
How do you build a forest because of the fence?
Right.
We're exploring how this new enclosure, this legislative fence,
Yeah.
might actually create a sort of microclimate for change.
Hmm.
How can a mandate that seems designed to narrow instruction actually be, well, repurposed, used strategically to fund the kind of broad, holistic professional learning that, frankly, its architects probably wanted to shut down?
Okay, so let's trace how this fence got built, because the sources are clear. This wasn't an overnight thing, right?
Not at all. Decades in the making. It comes from this drive to manage education more systematically, more controllably.
And that meant changing what literacy means.
Precisely. It shifted
Yeah.
from something about understanding meaning, engaging with the world, to something you measure with metrics,
Oh.
reading rates, decoding accuracy, that kind of thing. One source really critiques this, calling it turning instruction into a product line.
A product line. Wow.
Yeah, that shift from, let's say, interpretation to just technical skill, it's fundamental. When reading becomes just pronouncing words correctly, you lose something vital.
And the sources point to examples.
Oh, yeah. The early 2000s, Writing First.
Yeah.
That was maybe the first really big national push for this kind of enclosure.
I remember that.
Framed as accountability, sure. But the sources argue is really rooted in this deep suspicion, this idea that teachers couldn't be trusted, that they needed scripts.
So control the teacher, control the outcome.
Exactly. And that control idea seeped into teacher training certification. You mentioned RICA, that gatekeeper exam.
Yes.
The sources argue tests like that often end up measuring allegiance to a specific method,
Yeah.
phonemic purity, rather than a deep, nuanced understanding of how different kids actually learn language.
Which assumes there's only one right way.
That's the core assumption driving so many of these reforms, isn't it? This belief that language can be perfectly managed, that all the messy human differences in learning can just be, reduced to training data.
And when they use the word science in these laws.
It often means control, not discovery. According to these sources, anyway. It's about managing the system, making it predictable.
So if the goal is control, what's the big downside in the classroom? What happens?
You get an educational monoculture. That's the real danger.
Viticulture.
Yeah, like planting only one type of crop. The idea, maybe mistaken, was that if every teacher did the exact same thing, followed the same script, all kids would just magically succeed.
But kids aren't cornfields.
Exactly. Real learning, real ecosystems, they thrive on diversity, on difference. The moment you ignore, or worse, pathologize kids who don't learn in that one specific analytic way, you limit everything.
You root out the difference.
Right. Standardization got mistaken for salvation, but it might actually be limiting potential.
Okay, so that's the history, this long push for control. How does that manifest today? That brings us to these newer laws, like AB 1454 in California. And the sources warn, this isn't just a California thing, is it?
No, absolutely not. Think of it as a prototype, a model for standardizing curriculum that could easily be exported elsewhere.
So what's the mechanism? How does this particular fence work?
Well, it's quite clever in a way,
Yeah.
and maybe a little insidious. It focuses on controlling teachers through mandatory professional development, PD.
Ah, the training.
Exactly. The sources call it the main lever for ideological re-education. The state ends up controlling not just what books or programs districts buy.
But how teachers are actually taught to think about teaching literacy.
That's it precisely. It shapes their whole conceptualization of the acts.
But hang on, these bills, they're often framed using words like equity and evidence-based instruction, right? How do they square that with what seems like a very narrow definition of evidence? One that maybe leaves out, what, 40% of learners?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The rationale relies on a very specific, quite narrow, almost hierarchical interpretation of evidence. The mandated training basically says, okay, evidence means phonics first, phonemic awareness second, and comprehension. Well, that's a distant third.
Wow.
So they essentially equate evidence-based with vendor-approved materials that fit that specific model. They define the evidence they want to see.
And disregard anything that doesn't fit. They build the fence around their preferred evidence.
You got it. So the state uses the funding for teacher training to lock in a particular methodology.
Yeah.
But, and this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, so despite this clear aim to restrict things, to narrow the definition, the source has found something, a loophole.
Exactly. A crucial bit of bureaucratic language hidden in the fine print of AB 1454. They call it a quiet clause of equivalency.
Equivalency. Okay, what does that mean practically?
This is the strategic key. The law mandates a huge amount of professional development, right? Massive funding for teacher training time. But this clause says districts can meet that PD requirement through alternative programs, as long as those programs can be shown to be, quote, aligned with current research. And this is critical, effective for diverse learners.
Ah, so the mandate itself accidentally creates the funding and the time for teachers to learn something different, potentially.
Precisely. The money is there, the structure is there, so the task shifts. It's not about fighting the bill head-on anymore, maybe.
It's about occupying it.
Sort of. A tactical occupation of the structure the bill created. You stop fighting the fence itself, and you start using the structure that funded network for professional learning to plant something totally different inside it.
Okay.
Because that language in the law, evidence-based, effective for diverse learners, it might not be as narrow as the original architects thought.
How so?
Those phrases, if interpreted robustly, can actually hold the entire breadth of real cognitive science, linguistics, anthropology, everything we know about how diverse humans acquire language.
So if advocates for a more holistic, meaning-focused approach can present their evidence rigorously,
using the state's own criteria,
they can legally satisfy the law and use those funds for a completely different kind of training.
That's the strategy. Meet the bureaucratic demands, check the boxes, but fundamentally change the educational philosophy being funded. It's about repurposing.
Okay, I like this idea. Constructive fidelity, using the law structure for a different purpose. So what does this alternative blueprint actually look like? What would teachers learn in this repurposed PD time? The sources mention 3 specific texts.
Yeah, they lay out this integrated curriculum built around 3 foundational works. This gives real substance to fill that mandated PD time.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is called No Place for Autism. Its role is to anchor the whole approach. It starts by saying, look, neurodivergence, the fact that people process information differently isn't the exception. It's the baseline human condition.
Right. We're all wired differently.
Exactly. So if you start there, you have to teach in a way that reaches all minds, not just one type.
Makes sense. What's the second text?
That one's holistic language instruction. This provides the, let's say, theoretical canopy. It shows teachers how different ways of learning language can actually work together, specifically analytic language processing.
That's the breaking down words and sounds approach.
Right, the traditional focus. How that can braid together successfully with gestalt language processing.
Gestalt. Okay, define that one again. That's crucial here.
Super crucial. Analytic learners break language into small parts and build up. Gestalt learners, often that 40% potentially failed by the narrow approach, they tend to absorb language in whole chunks first.
Like lines from movies or songs.
Exactly. Big, meaningful chunks are gestalts. They learn by using those whole chunks first and only later start breaking them down into individual words. This holistic model says we need to honor and teach both pathways.
Got it. And the third text?
The third is Decolonising Language Education. This brings in the ethical dimension, the air we breathe. It pushes back against purely mechanistic models and restores the cultural and social roots of language.
So making sure literacy is seen as connection, relationship.
Not just recitation from a script.
Exactly. What does this actually look like in a classroom then? What's the practical difference?
Oh, it's huge. Teachers shift from being like technicians just following a script to being researchers in their own classrooms. They learn to notice and document genuine understanding, not just check off skills.
And it means both types of learners can thrive together.
That's the goal. Analytic kids and gestalt kids sharing a classroom, and neither one is seen as a deviation from the other. A teacher wouldn't just ask a child to sound out a word. They might also observe that same child using a whole memorized phrase from, say, a TV show, but using it to express a totally new, original idea in that moment.
And that's literacy for that child.
That's literacy in action for a gestalt processor, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the goal is this constructive fidelity you mentioned. Honor the law's stated purpose, all kids learning to read, but do it by restoring the developmental and social richness the original blueprint kind of forgot.
Okay, this is a really different way of thinking about progress. If we're moving beyond just decoding speed and accuracy, what does measurable evidence look like in this meaning-based approach? Can you actually measure this stuff rigorously?
Absolutely. The sources argue that comprehension in context is measurable, but you need different tools. Tools that, as they put it, listen instead of dissect.
Listen instead of dissect. I like that. So what are we listening for? What are the examples?
We need to broaden what counts as evidence. Things that
What?
actually share understanding. Can the student retell a story in their own words? Can they sequence events logically? Can they make inferences? Can they use language flexibly to communicate their own ideas?
Okay, that makes sense. And there was that specific marker mentioned for Gestalt learners, narrative reconstruction. What is that again?
Right, that's a really key measurable sign of progress for these kids. It's the shift you see when a child goes from just repeating a memorized chunk of language, the Gestalt, like to infinity and beyond,
Right.
to actually breaking that chunk down and using the individual words to make their own new sentence. Like maybe they later say, let's go beyond the blocks.
Taking it apart and rebuilding.
Exactly. That movement from the repeated chunk to original intentional language that's traceable, quantifiable literacy growth, you can document that.
And the key point here is that this isn't some brand new theory just invented to get around the law, right? There's history here.
Oh, absolutely not. This is built on solid scientific foundations. The sources trace the lineage clearly. You've got Vygotsky talking about speech and thought being intertwined way back. You've got researchers like Ann Peters documenting what we now call Gestalt language processing back in the 1970s.
Wow, okay.
And today, you have modern frameworks informed by natural language acquisition, or NLA, being used by speech pathologists all over the world to support exactly these kinds of learners.
So the argument is embracing this isn't anti-science. It's actually completing the science.
That's a great way to put it. It's about studying all minds, the full spectrum, not just the analytic ones that fit neatly into the old boxes. It's about reconnecting the parts of human communication, speaking, listening, reading, writing, that maybe got artificially separated. Hashtag, tag, tag, outro.
So wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway for you, the learner, trying to make sense of all these policy fights and teaching debates? First, remember this fence, this model of funded, standardized PD. It's likely a prototype.
Yeah, it's designed to be exported. What happens in California probably won't stay in California.
And the stakes feel really high here. It's the literacy of that other 40%, as the sources put it. The Gestalt learners, the story thinkers, the intuitive connectors. Their way of learning is what's really on the line.
Absolutely. But the strategy proposed here is about finding the opportunity within the constraint. By focusing on occupying that mandated PD structure, educators can try to turn what feels like surveillance
into scaffolding.
Exactly. Or as one source beautifully puts it, turning it into a trellis for vines, showing that where the architects maybe expected narrow robotic compliance, teachers can actually cultivate broad, rich, pedagogical coherence.
So the idea is you turn compliance into coherence. You inhabit the funding structure the law provides.
The teachers become like saplings, planting seeds within that structure.
Until eventually, maybe, they grow a forest, a diverse, healthy ecosystem so vast and thriving
that nobody even remembers where that original narrow fence used to stand.
Wow.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to chew on. If a standardized mandate, maybe unintentionally, ends up providing the funding and the structure needed for a more holistic, truly inclusive change that helps every child, does the original restrictive intent of that law matter more than the positive, inclusive outcome it might actually enable for education?
That is quite the question to ponder.